Welcome back to the 46th episode of Coffee with Krav. Grab your coffee, grab whatever you want, grab something to drink. I'm Mark Kravitz, and on the show, I have conversations with different people from different walks of life where I'm looking to educate, entertain, and have some fun. Today, we're diving into a topic that hits home for millions of Americans: the emotional, financial, and logistical balancing act of caring for aging parents while still raising children, building careers, and trying to carve out a little space of their own lives. And there's no one better to guide us through this conversation than today's guest, Candace Dellacona. Candace is a principal at Offutt Kerman, and she is considered a family lawyer. She is an advocate for multi-generational families, the host of the acclaimed podcast, The Sandwich Generation Survival Guide. Candace has spent her career helping families navigate some of life's most complicated transitions, planning for the future, managing elder care challenges, making tough medical or financial decisions, and preserving harmony across generations. Through her legal work and her podcast, she brings clarity, compassion, and a deeply human perspective to issues most of us will eventually face, but few of us feel we are prepared for. Today, we're going to explore what it really means to be part of the sandwich generation, why estate planning is so much more than just paperwork, and how families can communicate, collaborate, and care for one another with less stress and more intention. Whether you're supporting a kid, a parent, or both, this episode will give you actionable guidance and a little relief knowing you're not doing this alone. So let's jump in. Candace, welcome to Coffee with Krav.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. I'm thrilled to be here.
Fantastic. So let's go back to your childhood. Were there any breadcrumbs out there that you're going to go into law?
When I look back, I think perhaps, I definitely had sort of a sense of, maybe right and wrong and black and white in ways that probably didn't serve me all that well. And I think that those of us who fall in that camp definitely look to the law for some order in that regard. So yeah, maybe.
You're on the debate team?
I wasn't, but I was in Model UN and, certainly public speaking and things like that have served me well in my legal career.
Okay, excellent. I'm just going to skip around a bit if it's okay.
Absolutely.
You have a very popular podcast. I mentioned that a second ago, the Sandwich Generation Survival Guide. What inspired you to launch this podcast?
Mark, I found myself sort of exactly where a lot of, our colleagues and friends and our clients are, which is sort of in the middle. And really what precipitated it is that I was raising my 3 teenagers and, a spouse to my husband. And I found myself being the primary advocate and caregiver for my gay uncle who lived here in the city, who didn't have children of his own and didn't have the same sort of traditional quote unquote infrastructure. And so I found myself running back and forth between the office and, kids' sporting events and making sure that my clients' needs were met. And added in was the advocacy piece for my uncle who was quite sick. And I realized that although I had all these resources and, here I am in kind of the midst of knowing what the resources were, I still felt totally and completely overwhelmed. And so I wanted to think about a way, Mark, to provide resources to people like me so that they weren't as overwhelmed as I was, I guess.
Wow. Well, according to AARP, there are 63 million Americans that are caregivers. 1 in 3 Americans are actually in the sandwich generation. So you weren't alone. So when you think about the sandwich generation, how do you personally define it? And what do you wish people understood more about the pressures that they face?
Yeah, I think one of the things to sort of think about is that the way that it's defined from a statistics perspective is through numbers. And basically what the AARP and other sort of think tanks have told us is that the sandwich generation is a certain age range. And I actually think that the numbers are much greater because the feeling of being in the sandwich can really apply to anyone who's advocating for people in various stages of life. For example, I deal with a lot of professional athletes who are on the younger side. They're in their 20s. They
Mm.
also have children and they are dealing with family members who maybe they are financially supporting. I would define that as being in the sandwich as well.
Yeah.
So when you think about it in a more broad term, you realize that I think being in the sandwich generation is a really good moniker for those of us in the middle of our lives and trying to sort of juggle various folks who we love and want to advocate for,
Hmm.
while trying not to get lost in the middle ourselves.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. And in your work with estate planning, and
Mhm.
in your work with families, what do you think is the most common misconception that people have about estate planning?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, it's something that many people put off. You and I know, having spoken about this topic a number of times,
Yeah.
where no one's really anxious to talk about death and dying and
Hmm.
disability. And so when you think about an estate planning lawyer, that certainly is the topic. But one of the things that I like to say to people is that it's really not about talking about the doom and gloom. It's about setting up the right infrastructure for your family to make sure that if something does happen, that all of the pieces are in place. And by thinking ahead and setting up the right infrastructure for your family and building that house, that structure,
Hmm.
there will be no crisis. I mean, look, the truth of the matter is we're all going to die. We know
Right.
that. That's a
Right.
certainty. So we have to plan for it. But going through the exercise really can be an exercise of empowerment rather than motivated by fear or crisis.
It's interesting when someone comes into the office. I always ask about estate planning. That's part of the questions that we ask, and they will say, "Yeah, when's the last time that you did some estate planning work?" When they kind of cock their head and they start looking up and they say, it was probably a few 4, 5, 6 years ago. It's usually 10 to 15 years ago when
Yeah.
they actually look at the documents. Oh my God, 1996! I can't believe it.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
true.
Yeah. So in talking about that, as an expert, what do you think is the top three documents every adult, regardless of their age or wealth, that they should have in place today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for every generation, whether, you are a young person just starting out and you don't necessarily have a ton of assets yet, or whether you're in middle life or, in the sunset of your career and looking towards retirement, I think what's really important is thinking about advance directives. So when you talk about the three documents, certainly I would say a power of attorney. And for those who don't know, a power of attorney is the document in which you appoint a person, an agent, to make financial decisions for you. And that document can have a lot of power. I mean, the title is a
Sure.
giveaway. And so you're appointing a person to make financial decisions for you in the event you're incapacitated and you can't make
Mm.
those decisions for yourself. A lot of people think, Mark, that if you have a spouse, then your spouse automatically has that right, and they don't. So making sure that someone has the ability to make financial decisions is so important. And you have to think about your 18-year-olds. Your 18-year-olds, even if they don't act like it, they're adults and they need a power of attorney.
Mm.
So, it's
Okay.
really important to think about as you launch them, whether they're headed to college or trade school or ready to enter the workforce. If they're 18, they're an adult, they need a power of attorney. They need somebody to be able to
Okay.
help them with finances if that, moment ever comes. So power of attorney is one document. The other
Okay.
document in New York, I would say, and actually anywhere, is a health directive. So in New York, we call it a healthcare proxy. Other states, we can call it health power of attorney. And what that is similar to a financial power of attorney because you're appointing a person, but you're appointing a person to make healthcare decisions for you. And the reason why that's so important is because you want to be the one to decide who makes healthcare decisions for you. You don't want your state or your local government to say, well, your next of kin is the person who decides. And if your next of kin is someone who doesn't necessarily know what your ideas are about living and dying and care,
Mm.
then you don't want that decision made for you. So having a healthcare directive is so important. And again, to the kids that you're launching into the world, think about them going away and, God forbid, get injured or being sick and ending up needing some kind of medical care. It's really important that they have a document that assigns who their person is to make those medical decisions. And you can see why it becomes even more important as you age because, we deal with a lot more ailments as we age
Sure.
than hopefully you do when you're a young person. So those are the top two. And then I would say A trust instrument would be the third, which is different than a will, Mark. And, I think when I first started out in my career 24 or so years ago, I was definitely not the lawyer that said that everybody needed a trust. And the reason why is because probate in general wasn't terrible. The process of bringing your will to court after somebody passed away wasn't terribly inefficient. But in the last 10 or so years, unfortunately, we can't say that anymore. So having a trust instrument is definitely a document that people should look into establishing so that upon incapacity or upon your passing, your family doesn't have to deal with a long, drawn out probate process. So those are probably the top three documents I'd recommend that people think about.
And if I said four, would a will be the fourth?
Yeah, probably would. Yeah, a will would is still a tried and true estate planning document. It directs where your assets go when you die. It directs guardianship if you are the parent of a minor children. So when we create trusts for clients, we always create wills to accompany them just in case they're needed.
Okay. And, we talked about there's a lot of people caring for aging parents. What estate planning red flags should they watch out for that might indicate it's time for a legal review?
There are a lot of different sort of triggers that, are important to kind of think about. So, for your client who wanders in, Mark, and says, I did estate planning 5 or so years ago, and it turns out it's 15 years ago. Certainly, I think that, the time that you last signed it. So a couple of years gone by, you need to take a review of your estate planning documents. But there are the D's that tell you what to do when you're thinking about the right time to review your estate planning documents. So the first is descendants. If you've had additional children or if you're now a grandparent, that is a great time to look at estate planning documents. The other D is distance. So if you've moved from the state where you initially created your documents, they should be reviewed. If all of your agents that you appointed in your estate planning documents have moved, they should probably be reviewed. The other D is disability. So in the event that you receive some kind of diagnosis, and it could be one that's life-limiting or life-changing, your estate planning documents need to be reviewed. Likewise, if any of your beneficiaries, your kids or your loved ones receive a diagnosis, your documents should be reviewed. And then, of course, divorce. So in the event that you've gone through a divorce or you've named your brother and sister-in-law as guardians of your minor children and they're now divorced, do you still want the same guardian to serve for your parents? So thinking about those D's can be really helpful and a good trigger to review your estate plan.
Excellent. So distance, disability, and divorce.
That's right.
I like that. I like that. The four D's. So inheritance, medical care, end of life wishes. These are very, very difficult conversations. How do you coach families through these emotional conversations?
They are hard conversations. And Mark, depending on, the family ethos and how you historically have dealt with these sensitive topics can really kind of inform your way of starting the conversation within your family. But, my general advice is always to start from a place of love and caring. And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of adult children who want to sort of initiate these conversations start the conversation because of a moment of crisis. And that could be precipitated in a fall or a diagnosis of a memory impairment condition. So being really sensitive about where your aging loved one is in their process is so important. So I think starting the conversation by saying, I want to help you figure this out, and I want you to tell me what to do because I love you and I don't want to substitute my wishes for yours, I think is a good place to start.
So I'm sitting down with clients, and some of people that are aging will share what their wealth is. They'll share what they're doing. They'll share a lot. And then there is a large section of people like, no, I'm not going to tell them. No way. No way. They're going to grab my money. They're going to want my money. They're going to want to do this. They're going to want to do that. They're going to want to buy a car with that. They're going to be knocking on the door for money. So, Is it different for each family? Should there be something that they reach a certain age that they should be telling their kids? Should it be, getting around, or there's one child, if they have three children, one child will understand the other child, and the third one will be knocking on the door every single day. So,
Yeah.
how do you deal with something like that?
It is really hard and it's tricky I do think that the conversation can evolve over time with the particular family members. I also think it's not one size fits all even within the family. So you just point out, Mark, I have three kids and they have very different skills than each other, and not every kid is cut out to have conversations like this with their parents. And I do think that parents do want to err on the side of transparency, and I understand that, and the feeling of, everyone being equally informed. But
Mhm.
I do think it's really important that you think about what those hurdles could be. And so if you have a child who is not maybe the most astute financially and has a tendency to ask for money, then there's a way to limit that information to explain how much is there. And so you can sort of frame the conversation based on the capability of the child. I think the other thing to think about is that parents need to remember that when they have conversations like this with their adult children, and their adult children are attached with spouses or partners or whomever, you should realize that in most circumstances, the conversation really isn't just being had with your children, because your children are going home and talking to their partners and their spouses about it. And they have their own set
Mm,
of sort of family rules and family
that's true.
ethos from their families of origin. So just being kind of mindful as to how this information is shared and who it's being processed with is really, really important.
But what about fairness? Okay. So I have two kids. One's married, one's not. One will hopefully get married soon. But what about fairness? If I shared information with one and I didn't share information with the other, or if I created I know you mentioned everyone should have trust, but let's say one of the kids I create a trust for, and the other one I just, upon my passing and my wife's passing, we just give the money to them. Hey, and I'm
Yeah.
gone.
Yep.
Hey, you got a trust? I got all the money, and well, why, what's going on here? How do you deal with the
I
fairness
mean,
of something like that?
I think, sometimes in some families see equality as really important. And that equality and the need for equality can supersede what you might think as a parent makes sense in terms of limiting your kids' access to money, meaning you
Mm.
might say, look, I know that my son is a disaster with money, but if I don't leave this money outright to him like I am to his sister, it will damage their relationship forever.
Mm.
So, at the risk of leaving it all to him and having him spend it in a year, that's what I'm doing because I don't ever want it to be seen as unfair.
So, question, would it make sense for that parent to have that conversation before they pass so that you can get it out into the open beforehand rather than after?
Here's a couple of problems with that. I used to think about transparency all the time. And I don't know if it was because I was like the young adult kid and thinking about how I felt, but I do think when parents share the level of detail with your intentions related to, is your money going to be held in further trust? Is your brother going to have unbridled access to his own money? If you share these types of decisions with your kids while you're making them, some kids, not all, but some kids think that they're going to be a participant in that conversation and that their input is going to be
Yes.
wanted, as opposed to a parent just saying, FYI, I'm giving you this information. This is what's going to happen. Depending on how the family works and what the dynamics are you opening yourself up to debate? When it's not a debate, it's your directive. You're the parent,
Mm.
right?
That's
So
good.
it
Yeah.
depends. What I would say, one of the things that I really do encourage my clients and families to think about, particularly when there's an unequal distribution. So, let's say not even 50-50, you're going to say 70-30 in favor of one of your children, or you're going to say the money is going to be held in trust for one of the kids and the other kid is going to get their inheritance outright. I think it's really important to write something called a letter of intent. A letter of
Okay.
intent is a document that just sounds like what it is. It's a letter. And you leave it behind to explain your decision process and
I
why
like
you
that.
did something the way that you did. Generally, we don't share letters of intent until after people pass away,
Mhm.
because they're not there to answer the questions. And sometimes that can be a real relationship saver between siblings.
That
Because you
makes
never
sense.
want one sibling thinking that they exercise influence or told their parents to do it a certain way. So knowing that the parents made up his or her mind or their minds, independent of outside influence, and they can kind of explain the rationale for it, can sometimes really be helpful to the family members left behind.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're doing a 70/30, hey, I'm doing the 70/30. Here's the letter of intent. This is what uh, my wife and I we decided, and these are the reasons why. That makes a tremendous amount of sense.
Yeah.
The one getting 30 still might be pissed,
Of course, but they're not going to be
but
mad at
but at
their
least this
sibling.
is
They won't be mad at their sibling. Maybe they'll
right.
be mad at you, right? But
Correct,
but
correct.
the other thing is, and what I think about a lot when I do this type of planning, particularly because it can be a family exercise, Mark. And you and I have talked about that a lot, where we help families, and
Mhm.
we often help multiple generations of one family. And I think when you have a really nice and cohesive family with multiple generations, and there is a lot of dialogue between them, you want to sort of preserve that. And you want to make sure that that continues on. So having communication and balancing it with, you know, my decision is my decision. And we have to think about often who is our client, right? So I do think about a lot who is my client, and I
Mhm.
have to make sure that the advice is directly for them, not for their adult kids.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of do-it-yourselfers out there. They go on ChatGPT, they're going on the internet, and they rely on these templates. What do you think is the biggest mistake that people make when they start relying on the internet for estate planning?
Oh gosh. I mean, do understand the reason why people kind of resort to, trying to do it yourself, right? I think that the estate planning process is not inexpensive. I don't think it's prohibitively expensive, but it's not inexpensive. And so the need to try to figure it out on your own is completely understandable. But what I'll say is this: if you're diagnosed with cancer or dementia or Parkinson's, you're generally not going on WebMD to figure out what your prescription should be. And you're definitely not going on WebMD to figure out what your prognosis is. So I think it's really important that you sit down with a real life professional and talk to that professional with the specifics about your estate plan. Estate planning differs greatly from state to state. There are different rules and regulations regarding taxes, regarding inheritances in every state in our
Right.
country. So to go online and draft in kind of generalities is really dangerous and can be really expensive for a family. And knowing that you got the right advice specific to your family is so much less expensive than trying to fix an error down the line.
Yeah, when it's too late, it's too late,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
Nothing you can do. I think storytelling, people get great information and great understanding when you have storytelling. So, is there a particular client story, without using names, you don't have to use names,
Yeah.
that best illustrates how good planning prevents heartbreak and chaos?
Yeah, I mean, I have so many, right? From the elder law perspective, as it relates to asset protection planning for clients who perhaps don't have unlimited resources to pay for care. I did a tremendous amount of elder law early in my career. And what elder law is making sure that in the future, if you can qualify for Medicaid, which is the entity, the government entity that will pay for your long-term care, that Medicaid could pay for your care in the long term. And so I have so many examples of clients who thought ahead and created these irrevocable Medicaid trusts. And they put their houses and their assets into these trusts in advance of being sick and getting calls, 5, 6, 7 years down the line from the adult children in a panic because mom or dad had a stroke or something pretty catastrophic happened to their health. And they found out that mom or dad needed 24-hour care or had to stay in a nursing home. And they're really worried about how they were going to pay for it. And my being able to say, we got you covered because your parents thought ahead and
Mm.
created this trust and put their house in the trust and their money in the trust, and we can get them on Medicaid, no problem. They'll qualify. Those are great calls, to have with clients. And there are so many that I can think of in the last 24 years where I
So,
was
so just
able to.
sticking with that story, does that handcuff the parents because they put all this stuff out of their name? And yes, there's a reason for that. And
Yeah.
yes, that was a good call with the kids. But let's think about the parent. They want to go on vacation. They want to do all kinds of different things. Are they handcuffed then?
That's a great question. And I think that's one of the questions the clients ask when they learn about these trusts. And the answer is it depends. My goal is to never make sure they're handcuffed. I say to clients all the time, look, I can protect everything that you have, but you don't want to live your life beholden to qualifying for Medicaid one day,
Right.
right? So
Right.
there's a really good balance between protecting what you have and still living your life and going out to dinner and going on vacation. So doing Medicaid planning is not an all or nothing kind of proposal. It's taking a look at what you have and figuring out what your greatest vulnerabilities are. I have plenty of clients, Mark, who say, look, I'm happy putting my house in the trust because I can still live in the house. I can
Mhm.
still sell it if I wanted, but I don't want to put my money in the trust. And that's okay. And so if that client in the future needs care and they still have money in their name, we may have to do a couple of other things and they may have to spend some of that money before they can get to Medicaid, but their house is protected. And that's really what they were looking to do. So I do think it's a balancing act to not have the handcuffs and not feel like you're totally boxed in, but not totally exposed and completely vulnerable in the event somebody gets sick.
Okay. And that's where the conversation is. And you can't have a conversation with ChatGPT or the internet. So
Exactly
going back.
right. Right.
So in the sandwich generation, once again, you're worried about your kids, you're worried about your parents, and you're worried about yourself. How should the parents think about balancing their own retirement goals
Yeah.
while financially supporting multiple generations?
Yeah. I think one of the things that you said is worrying about yourself. I think part of the problem is we don't worry as much about ourselves and we need to.
Mm.
So thinking about, financially supporting multiple generations, for most people, it's a deal breaker, right? I think it's really important to, as the old sort of expression goes, put the oxygen mask on yourself first. You cannot help other people if your own house is on fire. So making sure that your house is in order, that you have set up the right infrastructure for yourself, and then you have to look outward to help others.
Okay, that's very, very fair. We always talk about paying yourself first. I always, when I've done my educational courses, I always talk about give till it hurts. How much do I give? How much should I be putting away? Give till it hurts.
Yeah.
Well, I can't put that extra dollar. Oh, that hurts. Okay, you did it. And that money will multiply over time, and you're creating wealth for yourself, and you're going to need that wealth to help your parents and help the kids as well.
Really good advice. And being mindful of the fact that particularly in the middle, these are our working years, and it's really hard to make up for that lost income and those opportunities to save when you're not working.
Right.
So this is the time to do it.
So, in talking about that, what do you think is the most overlooked financial risk, taxes, long-term care, other costs that people should plan for earlier than they think?
I definitely think looking at your long-term care and insurance needs, because while I don't sell insurance, I am not an insurance expert, Mark, as you know. I leave that in your camp with a line. But what I'll say is that, making sure that there's some level of insurability so that you can protect yourself against, things that none of us want to happen. And making sure that you have those plans in place well before you need them. I bring up long-term care because, that is one of the most expensive propositions after college that we have to worry about. And so making sure that you're covered, and there are so many different products. I'm not even educated enough to talk about them, but there are so many different products that are not prohibitively expensive. I myself have a policy. I'm 51 years old, and I think it's really important to think about those things. So just like you're saving for your kids 529 in college and higher education, you have to think about your own vulnerability. So looking to those sort of measures and your financial advisor to help you make those decisions is really important.
Excellent, excellent advice. Going back to your podcast, I'm going to ask a few questions about that. Is there an episode or a guest from your show who shifted your own perspective on caregiving, family, or legacy?
I've had so many interesting and inspiring guests on the podcast, but one of my favorite episodes, and they didn't necessarily shift my perspective, but it filled me with such hope, and I hope the listeners felt the same way, was this really interesting person named Neil Shaw, who was the founder of Care Yaya. And Care Yaya is this resource that pairs up college students and medical students with seniors in their community to help provide those, companion services. And Neil was a caregiver himself for his wife who was sick. And he had sort of made his money on Wall Street and really was looking for a way to provide resources to those of us in the sandwich generation and found ourselves in the caregiver space. And so Carrie Yaya has sought to connect these really interesting, smart young people with older adults. And I interviewed one of the college students who was a med student from University of Michigan, headed off to medical school. And she was talking about how many lessons she'd learned from the senior that she was providing these
Hmm,
services to. And
interesting.
it really made me think about, the silence of our older generation and how our country, unfortunately, doesn't value seniors as much as they do young people, and thinking about how much seniors also have to offer,
Sure.
to these young people. So they were providing this home care service and these companion services. But what really sort of dawned on me when I was talking with Sydney, this young college student, was how much she was getting from this
Yeah.
elderly man she was spending so much time with. And it was such a beautiful kind of moment where I'm like, gosh, there is so much reciprocity and so much, opportunity to learn from each other across generations. So that was one of my favorite episodes also.
I love that. I really love that. And speaking of that, is there any free resources that people that are listening here that can use off the top of your head?
Yeah, I mean, one of the programs that I've spoken about before is this new pilot program that came out through Medicare called the Guide Program, which is essentially getting a free geriatric care manager through the government. It's a pilot program because it's not in every state yet, although it is rolled out in most states. And basically, the criteria is you have to have been diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's, which is, as caregivers, one of the most challenging positions to find yourselves in with memory impairment. And the program through Guide is really remarkable. And it really focuses on the caregiver in addition to the patient themselves.
Hmm.
So the Guide program will connect the caregiver with the right doctors, the right community resources, so adult daycare programs and the right neurologists for anything related to memory impairment. And it's entirely free. So I encourage all of the listeners out there who have loved ones, neighbors, parents, anyone with memory impairment like dementia or Alzheimer's to take a look at that Guide program because it really is an incredible resource. It's brand new.
Excellent. That was so helpful. And again, talk about the podcast. What conversations or themes have really resonated most deeply with the audience?
I think the theme is community. And, what I tried to do with the podcast and launching the podcast and my own experience and why I thought there was a need is because we all feel so alone in our caregiving. It can be a really isolating time in our life. And
Sure.
I think that, not to disparage our male counterparts, Mark, but the vast majority of caregiving is administered by women. And there's a narrative in our country that women can kind of do it all, the superwoman moniker and, thinking about being strong for our family or the backbone of our family. So it's really, really hard for us to ask for help and accept help, even when it's
Mm.
offered. So creating a community in the podcast, and I get so many beautiful emails from people thanking me for sharing a particular person on the podcast as a resource because they didn't know that that type of help was available. They didn't know how to have the conversation. So I think community is really important because we are all in this together, and nobody gets out of life without aging if we're lucky.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. And if you can create one lasting impact through your podcast or your legal work, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that somewhere along the line, people feel that they were helped by the information, that I maybe made something that was really difficult or really sad or really challenging just a little bit easier. Listen, I know how it feels to be on the other side. I, was a caregiver who lost my loved one. I lost my dad. I lost my uncle. I even
Mm,
lost a younger brother.
mm,
So the empathy piece is never lost on me. I think it's really important that your professionals that you engage, yes, they should be the top in your field, but they also should be really good listeners and they should
sure.
find in themselves the empathy and the sympathy because it makes it a heck of a lot easier when the professionals guiding you care about you too
Yeah,
and really want the best for you. I think that that really can make the difference.
makes a lot of sense. So I saw you on a CBS morning show talking about the sandwich generation. How'd you get that gig?
Yeah, that was fun. I'll tell you. One of Gail King's producers reached out to me last summer and I heard that a couple of the hosts were fans of the podcast and they were finding themselves kind of in the middle of the sandwich generation, just like the rest of us, Mark. And they invited me on. So that's been really exciting. I've appeared a couple of times and hopefully you won't have seen the last of me on CBS mornings.
Well, I'm a big fan of you, so hopefully they'll be smart and have you as a regular guest coming in. I always like to end with with one question that is, was there any question that I should have asked that I didn't, or is there any parting words of encouragement that you'd like to say?
You asked a lot of great questions. What I would say, in terms of parting words is you should make sure that whomever is guiding you, whatever estate planning lawyer you find or elder law attorney that you find, you have a good rapport with them because it's a relationship that's going to last probably a good amount of time. It's not transactional. We're talking about the most tender things, interpersonal relationships within your family, money, death, dying, illness, and all those
Mm,
things. So you should
right.
really make sure that the person that you engage you feel comfortable with sharing those most intimate and sometimes tender details, just like your financial advisor and the reason why people come to you, Mark. So that's my advice for all of those listening today.
Excellent. Candace, you've said it all, and that brings us to the end of our conversation today. A huge thank you to Candace Dellacona for sharing her wisdom, her warmth, her deep understanding of what it means to navigate life in the sandwich generation. Her perspective reminds us that while these responsibilities can be overwhelming, they're also an opportunity to strengthen relationships, protect the people we love, and build legacies rooted in intention and compassion. If today's episode sparked questions, gave you clarity, or helped you feel a little less alone in this juggle, you're not alone. That's exactly why we're here. But be sure to check out Candace's podcast, The Sandwich Generation Survival Guide, for more conversations and insights to support you on this journey. And until next time, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and we'll see you soon at the next Coffee with Krav. Thank you. Thank you, Candace.
Thanks, Mark.